All right, so we had started chapter 7.5, and I explained that we started this chapter because we have to imagine that our spreadsheet has a lot of data inside of it, and you want to look for some piece of data. You want to look for something specific. So, say for instance, you're a business and you're recording all the items that you're selling, the price, the VAT, the discount. So there's going to be a lot of information, and maybe you're going to look for something specific, a certain item that starts with a certain letter, a certain price range of items. So that is why we have this chapter here. So the first thing we had looked at last week is how to sort our data. That's one way we can find some sort of specific data sorting. Can anyone remember how do we sort one column?
Sir, just click on any of the cells in the table, and then in the under the data tab, there's the option to filter. You just click on it, and it should automatically identify the table.
Very good, very good. So basically, when you want to sort one column, it's only one um, it's only one cell in that column you need to select. So like for instance, this column here, if we want to sort this column, you would only select one cell inside of it and use that sort option. Does anyone remember how we sort two columns or more? What feature, what option do we use? Sierra? Shaniqua? What's the name of the feature that we're supposed to use for two or more columns? Ranlin? The name of that feature is the custom sort feature. It's basically close by. Um, so if you look at an actual spreadsheet, so when you right click and you go to sort, the sort options are right here, but right close by is the custom sort, even on the home tab. Over to the right hand side here, notice custom sort. Even when you go to data, you have this custom sort option here. We don't have any data, so it's not gonna sort anything. Custom. So this box here is what we use for two levels of sorting. Um, can anyone remember how many types of filters we have? That was the next thing we looked at. How many types of filters do we have?
Sir, two.
Correct. And what are they?
Sir, auto filter, or simple filter, I think is the other name, and then there's advanced filter.
Very good. That is correct. So our two filter, and we started by looking at one of them. Um, that is the auto filter, which is also called a simple filter because you're doing some simple filtering. But when you want more advanced filters, when you want more advanced criterias, that is when you would use the advanced filter. So that's what we're going to look at today, how to use the advanced filter. Um, so before we go to the reading, I want to try something. Let's look at an example first, and then we are going to look at the filter. So let me find a file that we can use. Nope, not that. Donations. I think this can work. Yeah, this can work. So, it was already used in it. Clear this off. Good. So, I'm hoping you guys remember that we have two filters as mentioned. And when you go to the data tab, you're going to see the two filter options here. And if you want to turn on the simple filter or the auto filter, you basically click on any cell inside of the table. It's going to detect the table and you click on the filter. The arrow appears on each column and you basically click on it and apply your filter that you would want. So that is how you would use the auto filter. Now, the advanced filter, how do you use the advanced filter? Well, if you notice from this image here, it's three things you would need to create the advanced filter. One, you're going to need the original data, which is basically the table that you want to filter. Two, you're going to need a criteria range. So basically, you're creating the criteria in the spreadsheet. And three, you need to tell it where to put the filter data. So it's basically, when you're creating an advanced filter, these three things are what you need. So, for example, if you notice at the bottom here, I have my criteria. So, firstly, at the top here, we have our first requirement. This is our original data. This is the table that I want to filter. The second thing I need for my criteria is my criteria range. So, how do you create your criteria range? Well, basically, you highlight the headings and you copy it. You can type it back if you can spell each word correctly, student ID and so on, and type back everything you can. But if you mistype any one of the headings, it won't work. So that's why it's more beneficial to copy the headings and basically paste it for the criteria. That way you won't get any typos and it'll match. So you copy the headings and you paste it in another location. It's more effective to paste it like right underneath. That way you can neatly align the information. And under the heading, you basically create the criteria. Notice the question I'm asking here, less than 3. It's looking at the Roman numerals. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to make it simpler. I'm going to say less than 17. So that way you guys can clearly see that. Less than 17. So notice, remember we're creating a criteria. Criteria asking questions. Less than, more than, equal to, and so on. So notice, you're creating the criteria in the spreadsheet, on the spreadsheet. So what do you have to do next? Basically, only these two things here you would create. Your main table and your criteria. So once again, you click on any cell inside of the main table so that spreadsheet would automatically detect it. Then you go to data, the data tab, you go to advanced, and this box will appear. Are you guys following so far?
Yes, sir.
All right. So this box here is going to appear. So in this box, you need to indicate some information. So if you notice the very first option here, filter the list in place. This is something we talked about last week, and it's something you should remember. Filtering location, the output area. The simple filter would filter the information in place. So if you notice, when you filter something, it hides the rest of data and it shows you that output information, that output data. So it filters in place where the data is located. But if you want to see the original, you cannot, because the filter is basically blocking the original. So that's a disadvantage you can see, because if you want to see the original, you cannot. But if you don't need to, it won't be much of an issue. Whereas the advanced filter, it has the option for you to filter in place, but you can also filter to another location, copy to another location. This will copy the output to another location. So that's what we want. We want the output to go to somewhere else. So notice we have the three criterias here. Not criteria, three requirements. We have the list range, which is basically the table. Notice this is already highlighted. The table with the data inside of it. 2, we have our criteria. So if you click on the arrow, you can highlight it and then click back on the arrow again. So notice the criteria was highlighted there. And then lastly, copy to. So you can delete that and simply click on the arrow and click on the first cell. You could highlight all the, say for example, the headings, but just click on the first cell that you wanted to start from. That can work also. So I'm going to click on the first cell here, and I'm going to click back on the arrow, and that is basically it here. I said that I want to filter to another location. I put in my table range, I put in the criteria range, and I say where do I want to filter the data, and I click OK, and notice it outputs the information at the bottom there. So let me delete that too. So let's move up so we can see the main data at the top here. We can see our criteria here, and we can see our output there. You guys following on all that?
Yes, sir.
All right, let's go to the chapter now. So with all of that information in mind, let's go through some additional information about the advanced filter. Akila, can you start the reading for us?
Advanced filter. Although the auto-filter makes selecting records very simple, you may wish to have more control over the criteria used. You can place criteria on the spreadsheet itself and use an advanced filter to select records. You can then tell the computer the location of the records, the location of the criteria, and whether the list should be filtered in place or copied to another location. We will use the example shown in figure 7.43 to illustrate advanced filter. Sir, should I keep going?
Yes.
Notice the headings in row 1 can be copied and pasted in range G1 to J1 and range G6 to J6. The criteria in G2 to J3 consists of less than 11 and more than 150. Since these criteria are on the same row, this is an AND criteria. For the record to be selected, the rank has to be less than 11, and speakers has to be greater than 150. We now click in the data with the original data, and then choose the data advanced filter.
Great. You can pause there. So, as I mentioned, I compare the advanced filter to the simple filter. So if you want more control, you would use the advanced filter. And as I said, the criteria is on the spreadsheet. Now, I also indicated that it's 3 things you basically need for your advanced filter. the location of the record, which is the main table that you want to filter, the location of the criteria, and where do you want to filter. Do you want to filter in place or to another location? So those are the three things I mentioned that you need when you're creating an advanced filter. Now, I also mentioned that when you're creating the criteria, it's much easier to copy the headings. That way you can minimize any typos and so on. Now, if you notice, this one has 2 criteria, so we can actually try that. Close off this one. Yeah, so we can actually try 2 criteria. So notice this age says less than 17. So we can say if this is our output here, we can say greater than actually I'm going to create another one. I'm going to copy this here, paste it outside here, and under student ID I'm going to say greater than 9. So we won't see this 1 and this 2 here. So once again, I'm going to do the advanced filter. Click on any cell, click on advanced, copy to another location, highlight my table. It was already done because I selected a cell in the table. Highlight my criteria, that's this here, my criteria range, and select my location. I'm just going to select the one cell where it is going to start from, and OK. So notice I have my output here now. So age is less than 17 and student ID is greater than 5. And if you notice what I just said, I said age is less than 17 and student ID is greater than 9. And that is important to note because there are 2 types of criterias that you need to remember. There are 2 types of criterias. And this is not just a spreadsheet. This is also for database and even some programs when you topics we're going to learn in the future. So it's important for you to remember how these 2 types of criterias work. An criteria has the criterias in the same row. So this is how you can visually tell if a criteria is an criteria. So the fact that they both have the criteria in the same row, greater than 9, less than 17 is in the same row, it is called a AND criteria. So this here is an AND criteria because it has both of the criteria in the same row. Are you guys following so far?
Yes, sir.
All right. Any questions on creating the advanced filter before we move on? Is it simple or is it hard? No comments? Y'all making this class depressing. Do you guys understand how to create the advanced filter?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
All right. So that is how you create the advanced filter, and that is how you create the AND criteria. Now the next type of criteria let's see, I think we have to go down. Yes, we have to go down. Reading goes down. All right, so Jahim, could you continue the reading?
If you click in the table first, the computer automatically selects the correct range for the table. You can now enter the range for the criteria G1, J2. Note if you click on the copy to another location option, you would then also choose a range where the new list should be copied. If if we move one of the criteria to the next line, we create our criteria. For example, if 11, more than 11 is moved from G2 to G3, we create our criteria. This means the record will show if either criteria is true. When we choose the advanced filter menu options, however, we must remember to change the criteria range to include the third row to G1, G3 in this example.
Good. So, as I mentioned, you don't need to highlight the table as we saw. You can simply click in the table and it will automatically detect the table for you. Spreadsheet does that a lot for you. Now, how can you visually tell the other criteria? The other criteria is called the OR criteria, and the criteria is in the next line. So if you look at this example here, notice the two criterias are in different line, and it actually doesn't matter which order it is in. The less than 11 could have been at the top, but once the greater than 150 was at the bottom, once they were in different line, it would have been an OR criteria. Doesn't matter which order. So let's create one. So I'm going to put one row of space there, and I'm going to say greater than 9. I'm going to use the same criteria. Hopefully we get what I'm looking for. Let me delete this here. And let's create the advanced filter again. So I select any cell, data tab, advanced, copy to another location. My list range was automatically detected. I gotta highlight my criteria. Remember, you gotta highlight everything, headings and the criterias. And select my location, that cell there, from there, and click OK. So notice something went wrong. Let's try that again. Okay, table selected. Criteria selected. Output is selected. Okay, good. That's better. So this here is the criteria, and this here is our outputs. So visually, this is going to be our OR criteria. And so the OR criteria is on the left and the AND criteria is on the right. So once, as I mentioned, it doesn't matter what order you put it in. So I could put the greater than 9 at the top, delete this at the bottom, put the less than 17 at the bottom, delete that from the top, and I could delete this information here and here, and do over the advanced filter, copy to another location, select my criteria, pick my location, okay, and notice it still worked. Doesn't matter which order. So visually, that is how you can tell the difference between an AND and OR criteria. Now the important part is for you to understand how do they work. Why do we have different criteria and how do they work? Because if you notice, they both have the same question. They both have greater than 9 and they both have less than 17. But yet, they give us different outputs. This one on the left has more, and then the one on the right has less. So why is that? Well, please take note of the following. A AND criteria answers both, or how many questions they are, how many criteria they are at the same time. And criteria answers all criterias at the same time. Please take note of that. So answers all criterias at the same time. That's how you can remember it. So what is actually doing both of these questions here, you got to think of it as being true at the same time. Because if you notice, student ID, all of these values here are greater than 9. And under age, all of these values here are less than 17. So this output that you're seeing here answers both of these questions here at the same time. Are you guys following? You guys understand what I said?
Yes, sir.
The rest of you understand?
Yes, sir.
All right. So why is it now that the OR criteria gives you more outputs? It gives you more information here. Why? Well, because it answers the criteria one after the other. It answers the criteria one after the other. So it doesn't answer at the same time like the AND criteria. It's going to look at one of the criteria, put out all the output, then look at the other criteria and put out all of the output also. And that is why you have more data for the OR criteria. Because if you notice, student ID, it has greater than 9, but there's a 1 here, there's a 2. This 1 and this 2 here, it is not greater than 9, but yet it is here. Why? Because it is answering the second criteria. It is answering this second question here, less than 17. 14 here is less than 17. So because this 14 is less than 17, it's gonna output the information. It's not like the AND where it has to answer both at the same time. Both does not have to be true at the same time. It's just one of it has to be true. And the other one, the 15, this one here, it is less than 17. 15 is less than 17. So that is why it's going to output that piece of data, even though 2 is not greater than 9. So once again, AND criteria, it answers all of the criteria at the same time, or it answers all of the question at the same time. Everything must be true at the same time. Whereas the OR criteria, it's one after each other. Doesn't matter which one, doesn't matter which order, doesn't matter. All that matters is that it's gonna look at one of the criteria, basically put out all the output for it. So for instance, it look at the greater than 9 and it output all of this green here that you're seeing, this 3 green. But then it looked at the less than 17 and it saw that this blue needs to be output also. It saw that this was already out, so it left it, and then it saw another one, another blue, another less than 17, and it put that out also. So it's one after the other. Are you guys clear on that?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Great. Any questions? Because that's basically the end there of advanced filter. So if you have any questions on how to use the advanced filter or the criterias and how they work, now is the time. All right, I'll take the no questions as though the advanced filter looks as though it's simple to you guys, and I'm glad that it is. So once again, the main things to remember about the advanced filter is that it's three things you need to create it. You need the original data, you need your criteria range, and you need your output area. Where are you going to filter it? Is it in place or is it in another location? And then you also need to remember what are the two types of criteria. You have the AND criteria and you have the OR criteria. Those are two criteria. So those are the main things to remember in using the advanced filter. And why do we use it over the simple filter? Well, as the name indicates, it's more advanced. So you get to do more with this filter here. Alright, so next we're going to look at the pivot table. What is the pivot table? Remember, we're still on searching for records. So how can a pivot table help us to sort our information or find some sort of information? So let's see what is a pivot table and what is a pivot table, how do we create it, what do we use it for? Alicia, can you read for us?
As your pivot tables, as your data increases, it can become more time consuming to update ranges of data, functions, and formula. Depending on how you need to display your results, a pivot table makes it easy to summarize your data without alerting the original location of your data, even if more data is added to the spreadsheet. The pivot table can be quickly updated. Pivot charts can also be created from a pivot table. To create a pivot table from a set of data in a worksheet, you should check that your data is arranged as follows. You should at least have 3 columns of data. Each column of data should have its unique field heading. Your data should be organized in a tabular format and not have a blank row between the column headings and the first row of data. Check that the dataset also does not have blank rows or columns. Review the data to ensure that it has been entered accurately. Mixing up data causes incorrect results.
Great. So what is a pivot table? Well, as the name indicates, it's simply a table. It's just a table, but it's a special kind of table. It has some additional features there. And what is it used for? It is used to summarize your data without altering the original location. So it's like you already have the main table, like for example, this main table here with data inside of it. And you can basically, from this table, create another table, like if you're making a duplicate, so that you don't have to mess around with the original. Because remember, if you mess around with the original, it can affect the accuracy of your data. So you don't want to mess around with the original. What you want to do is create like a duplicate so that you can do anything you want with the table. So a quick and easy way to basically create that duplicate is using a pivot table to summarize that data. So how do we create a pivot table? What are the rules for creating a pivot table? Well, you must have at least 3 columns in your main table that you're creating this pivot table from. It must have at least 3 columns to create a proper pivot table. The columns must have headings, basically. That's this unique field heading. They must have headings, like for example, name, item, price, or like what you're seeing here, student ID, subject, and grade. They must have headings. 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 They must have he the data must be tabular. What do we mean by tabular? It's basically going downwards, or the information that is related to each other is in the row. So you have the headings across in the row in different columns, and all of the information is coming downwards. That is tabular. And basically you should not have any blank rows. There should be no blank rows or columns, because remember, when you click on a table, spreadsheet will detect that table. But if you're going to have a blank row or a blank column, it's like if you're disconnecting that table. So you're disconnecting the two pieces of data. It will not recognize age over here as being part of this table over here. So that's why there cannot be any blank row or column. And lastly, you need to ensure your data is accurate. Obviously, if you type in wrong data in the original data, then you're going to get wrong information in the pivot table. So whatever you put in the original table, it must be accurate. So how do we create this pivot table now? That's what we're going to look at. So what we're going to do, we're going to use this same table here. So once again, I'm going to click on any cell because it's going to detect the table. I clicked on 16. And you're going to go to Insert, and notice the pivot table option is here. So this box is going to appear when you click on it. And it's basically only two things you need to focus on. The one at the top, where you need to select the table. So because I clicked the cell, it was automatically selected. So I don't need to do that anymore. But if you didn't do that, you could simply click on the arrow and highlight the table like that. After you select your table, you basically need to indicate where do you want to put the pivot table. Do you want to put it in a new sheet or in an existing sheet? Maybe some sort of location in the sheet here. What I'm going to do, I'm going to put it right in the sheet here so we can see it right close by. I'm going to select this cell at the top here, click OK. Can't do that. It's a merge field. What is merged? Let's try it again. Pivot table, that is that, existing there. Can't do that. Why? Well, it's because of this here. No, obviously it could be. Let's move out a little more. Pivot table, existing, location out here. Okay, yes, that was it. So notice what came up. To build a report, choose fields from the pivot table list. So on the right hand side here, think of this as the pivot table builder. This is how you build the pivot table. This location here that you're seeing is where the pivot table will appear. But we have to build this table, and it's actually very simple. All you do, you can click, you can check off the information that you want, and it will automatically put it into one of these four boxes at the bottom. So say for instance you don't know what or where to put the data, you can simply check it and it will automatically put it for you. But say you do know, you simply click on the field and you drag it to where you want it to go. Do you want it to go in a row? Then you drop it off in the row. But don't worry if you made a mistake. You can simply uncheck it and it's going to disappear. And then you can go back to subject and drop it in the column now. So notice the subject is appearing in the column. Or you can click on it right here and just drag it over into row. Drag it back over the column, drag it back over into row. It's that simple. You just simply drag anything anywhere so that you can create a table. And if you notice, every time we do this, we're creating a whole different table. Every time we put it in a new location, it's a whole new table we are creating. So it's that simple to create a pivot table. the only thing that you would need to know is where would you need to put your data to present it properly, to summarize it properly. Would you need subject in the row, or would it be better in the column? That is going to be up to you to decide when you're designing it now. Are you guys following so far?
Yes, sir.
The rest of you sleeping as yet?
Sorry, you kind of lost me a little while back.
Where?
Sir, I understand what happens after we finish selecting the location for the pivot table. I got it from there, but from before there, I'm not sure what happened before that.
You just zoned out. So what we're gonna do, we're gonna go back over creating the pivot table. So creating the pivot table is the simplest part. You simply click on any cell, you go to insert, you click on pivot table, the range, you basically highlight it if it wasn't, and you select the location. I'm gonna choose new sheet now. So I'm gonna go over to a new sheet so that we can see it better now. So this here is where the pivot table is going to appear, what you see on the left hand side. But on the right hand side, this pivot table fields is how you create the pivot table, and it's just a fact of clicking on any one of the fields. We call the columns the fields. You just click on any one of the fields and you drop it into any one of the locations at the bottom here. If you notice, you have 4 boxes at the bottom. You have a filter box, you have a column box, you have a row box, and a value. The tree, row, column, and value, these 3 here, are the ones you're going to use the most. So a normal table is going to have rows and columns. A normal table is going to have rows and columns, and that's basically why you're putting the field into the row or the column, because you want to say that subject is going to appear in the columns. Notice it's appearing in each column, but say for instance you want it to appear in the row. You drop it over into row, and notice all of the subjects are in the rows now. Following now?
Yes, sir.
Or still confused? You sound like you're still confused.
No, sir, I got it.
Okay. So, as mentioned already, it's just dragging and dropping. You can drag and drop anything you want. Any single thing you want. Doesn't matter. What matters is when somebody tells you to create a pivot table, they might tell you basically how to put in the information. They might tell you, I want the grades in the row, I want the subject in the column, and that's how I want it to be built. Now, as mentioned, the column box, whatever you put in it, is going to appear in the column. So notice I have subject in the column, subject is appearing in the column. If I put subject in the row, subject is going to appear in the row. But if you notice, we're building this table, but we're basically only building headings. When you put inside the column and the row, you're only building headings. There's no data inside of the table. So how do you put data inside the table now? Well, let's make a simple table. I'm going to put the subject in the rows. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to put the grades inside of values. That is how you make a table in a pivot table. You have to put something inside of the values box. That's how you're going to get information in your table. So, but if you notice, it's not like ordinary table. It's not showing what grades I got or the students got for English, French, and Spanish. If you look back at the original table, we're seeing the grades here. It's Roman numerals. But in the pivot table, it's normal number. So what is happening? You gotta look back at your notes and remember that a pivot table is used to summarize your data. It's used for summarizing your data, to summarize it. So if you notice in the values box, it is counting the grades. It says count of grade. So what it's actually doing, it's summarizing the grades by counting it. So this table here that you're seeing, what it's actually doing, it's counting how many English we have. We have 2 English, we have 2 French, and we have 3 Spanish. And if you look back at the table here, you would notice that is the case here. 2 English, 2 French, and 3 Spanish. So it summarized that information there for us. Now counting is not the only thing it does. So in order to change this, we can click on this arrow here, value field settings, and we have different calculations we can carry out. We can say add the grades. So sum the grades, add the grades. So okay. So notice nothing came up because we basically can't add them. What can we do? We can get the average grade. So that was Roman numerals, so we won't get an average grade. Let's see. Let's try age. So we can take out grade and we can try age. So notice it's summing the age now because we can add the age. What we can do, we can count the age now. So we have 2 age at English, 2 age in French, 3 age in Spanish. But this doesn't really make sense, counting the age, as you can see. So summing the age would be more appropriate, adding the ages together. Or we could get the average age. That's also possible. So whatever you put in this values area will take up the space in your table, will take up the data location of your table, and you can basically say how you want that data to summarize. You have quite a few options here to summarize that data. And you can even format it if you need to format it. Are you guys following and all that?
Yes, sir.
So once again, to create a pivot table, you put whatever field, whatever headings you want in the row or the column. But when you want data inside the table, it has to go in the values. So another example, we can do age in the rows, and we can also use age once again. Doesn't mean you cannot use the same field. You can put age inside of the value. So what we can do, now we can actually count. So notice here now, I am counting how much of the same age I have. I have 1 14-year-old, 1 15-year-old, 3 16-year-old, and 2 18-year-olds. So a grand total of 7 persons, and that is a breakdown of their age there. So the pivot table, that is how you would create a pivot table to summarize your data. Now, as I mentioned, this box here, this pivot table fields, this is where you create your pivot table. Now say for instance you close it off, because you can click anywhere and it's going to come off, but some persons, they click this X here, and when they click back and forth, they don't see it come up anymore. And that box there is how you edit your pivot table. So if you don't get it, you won't be able to. So how do you get it back? Well, you could right click and you could go to show field list. That's going to bring back the box. Or you could go to the top, pivot table, analyze, and to the very right, you have field list here also. Either one could work to give you that pivot table fields box so that you can create or edit your pivot table. Alright, so there are two types of pivot tables now. Let's look at the two. Randlin, can you read for us?
The diagonal box is displayed with your range of data selected in figure 7.47. You can choose to place the pivot table on the new sheet or display it on the same sheet. Your pivot table is created by moving fields of data using drag and drop options. This creates a view of the original data but in a different format. One-dimensional pivot table. By default, Excel summarizes your data by either summing or counting the items. If so, numeric values are usually dragged to the values area. If you also drag a field to either the rows area or the columns area, you can create a one-dimensional pivot table. Suppose you wish to find out how many students in each subject receive results. Figure 7.48 shows the subject of field in the row area, while the grade field in the values area. The pivot table shows on the left as you drag the fields to their areas. This new pivot table is located in a new sheet, while the original data remains in its sheet.
Good. So, and let's see. So, a one-dimensional pivot table. We have two types of pivot table, or two kinds of pivot table, you can say. There's the one-dimensional pivot table, and it's basically just having a field in the row or the column. Either one, doesn't matter which one. So you can compare to that and or criteria situation that we had earlier. You can say that the one-dimensional is like that, and it's only in one location. So if you go back to our pivot table, we have a pivot table here, and if you look over on your right hand side in the fields list, we have age in rows. So column is empty. So by having a field in the row and column empty, we have a one-dimensional pivot table here. If I move age over to column and I keep row empty, again, that is also a one-dimensional pivot table. So it's just having one heading in either the row or the column. Doesn't matter which one. Once it's only one, you get a one-dimensional pivot table. Now we also have a two-dimensional pivot table. And that is basically when you have a field in the row and the column area. You have them both in this in both locations at the same time. So I could have age in the rows and student ID in the columns, and now I have a two-dimension pivot table. So it doesn't matter what is in which one. Once I have data in both row and column, I have a two-dimensional pivot table. Are you guys following?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
All right. So it's some simple information. Give me a second. Hello. So that's why I said you can join the next one on Thursday or just watch the recording. Alright, no problem. Yes. So a pivot table, that is how you create a pivot table, and that is the two types of pivot table that we have there. Now, any questions before we move on? All right, so let's look at frequency distribution. Then we have pivot charts, and then we're gonna wrap up there for tonight. So that's two more topics, and then we're gonna close off. So frequency distribution. What is a frequency distribution, and why do we need it? Anybody know what is a frequency? It's something you do in maths. No smart children. So when you look at a frequency of data, you're basically looking like at a range of data, a certain grouping of data, and you look at that specific group and you can compare it with other groups. So like for instance, persons, they would look at the 80s, and then they would look at the 90s, they would look at the 70s. So that's a frequency of 10 years. 70s, 80s, 90s, the 2000s. So those are frequencies there. So in spreadsheets, you can create frequencies so that you can look at data similarly. So let's see what this is about. Shaniqua, can you read for us? Shaniqua?
Frequency distribution. Sometimes you may want to count the number of times a value occurs in a set of data or how many times a specific payment was made between two dates. Creating a frequency distribution provides this information quickly for you. For example, suppose you have a list of students with their ages and you wish to find out how many students grouped in 2-year intervals registered for exams. Figure 7.50 shows the initial pivot table that is created after you drag the age field to both the rows area and the values area. Grouping the ages in intervals of 2 produces the frequency distribution for those in the 2 age ranges who registered for the subject.
All right, great. So as the paragraphs mention, it's like when you're grouping data and you want to understand what happened in that specific period. So like for instance, we're grouping this 10 years and we want to know, like for instance, how much sales was made in this specific time period and for all of these years, so that you can look at the specific data. So how do you create that frequency distribution? Well, to do so, we need to use the same pivot table. So I'm going to recreate the pivot table. So for instance here, I have age inside of rows. Now, one thing to note when you're creating a frequency, because for the pivot table, we can't have words inside of the rows or the columns, whichever case it may be. But to have a frequency deals with numbers. You cannot create a frequency with words. It can only be done with numbers. So whatever you're going to do, there has to be some sort of number. The data has to be numbers inside of the row or the column in order to create this frequency. So that's why I put age in the row. So how do you create a frequency now? Well, after you would have done that, you create that pivot table. You need to right click on the pivot table, and you're going to go to this group option here. So group, and in this group option, we can see what is the frequency we want it to be grouped by. So this 2 option at the top here, I can see what is my starting point and what's the ending point. So say for instance, I don't want 14. I can say start from 15. I can do that. But I'm going to start from 14. I want it in. And at the bottom, I can say grouped by 2. Every 2 years. What happened every 2 years? So, okay. And if you notice, it grouped it into 2 years. So, I have 2 14 to 15 year olds, and I have 5 16 to 18 year olds. If you want to ungroup, you have the ungroup option there. So once again, I can right click, select group, and I can say group by 3 now. Click OK. So notice I have a frequency distribution of 3 years. So from 14 to 16 in my class, I have 5 of those students, 14 to 16. And from 17 to 19, I have 2 of those students. So it's simple once again, like the rest of information, but it's just remembering how to create this frequency distribution. It's using this group and ungroup option here. And remember, obviously you can only group numbers, so you need to make use of numbers in order to create that frequency distribution. Now, before I forget, notice something here. So we're going to have subject in the row, and then we're going to count the subjects. So we have subject in the row, and we're going to count the subject. Now notice I'm going over to my main table. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to delete one of the Spanish, and I'm going to put in Japanese. If I can spell Japanese. Yes. So I put in Japanese there. Now, when I go over to my pivot table, do you guys think it's going to update or it's not going to update? What do you guys think? Is it going to change the pivot table or not? Any guesses? No one wants to guess? Is that a yes or a no? Well, it actually, yes, and the answer is no. It actually does not update your table. So that's something to remember. That's something very important to remember. If you change the original table, it does not automatically update your pivot table, because you got to think about it. This is a table, so it won't automatically change it. Now, say for instance, you already created this table. How can you add in the new information? Well, it's also very simple. You simply right click on the pivot table and you click refresh. That's all. You right click and you click refresh. And notice the new language was just added in. It was just updated. So I can once again change Japanese to Korean and go back to my pivot table, and once again right click, refresh, and notice the pivot table was now updated. So that is how you update your pivot table. You have to refresh it when you change the original data, and that is how you create your frequency distribution. Remember, you can only use numbers to group. Notice the group option. Notice when you put subject, what's going to happen? If I right click here, group, we're going to get an error. Cannot group that selection because it's words. You cannot group words, so it won't allow you. So you can only create a frequency distribution with numbers, and it's only the first row, the first column you can do it with. If I right click on over here, notice I don't get any group option unless it's another. It's still going to basically be the column, first column, and then you cannot group two columns together also. So no, I think that's because that was a Roman numeral. Yeah, so you can group multiple columns once it is numbers. Are you guys following so far?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Sir, no, my net failed and I don't know what you're talking about.
We're looking at frequency distribution.
Oh, sorry, the whole lot of editing. Okay, yeah, I'm gonna go over the back myself. Okay.
Yeah, so basically in a nutshell, frequency distribution is something you guys should be familiar with in maths. When you look at the frequency of data, so for instance, sometimes you might look at say for example years, the 70s, the 1970s, you might say 70s to 79, that's a frequency. And then you might say 80 to 89. And then you might ask, what happened between this time period here? So maybe how much computer was sold, how much music was produced within this frequency here. So how we create that is by using the same pivot table. You put a number data type, a number field in the row, and you basically right click and you choose the group option here. And you basically say, what do you want it to be grouped by? I want it to be grouped by 3. So notice this is years, age. So notice I have a frequency of 3 years. 14 to 16, I have 5 14 to 16 year olds, and I have 2 17 to 19 year olds. So that's basically it in a nutshell. All right, so the last thing is your pivot table. Pivot charts. Sierra, can you read for us?
Pivot charts. Now that you can summarize your data into a pivot table, a pivot chart can help you to visualize your results. To create a pivot chart, first select any cell within your pivot table. Then in the Pivot Table Tools section, locate the Analyze option and select Pivot Chart. You can now select a suitable chart type and click OK. Your new pivot chart will be placed on the same sheet as the pivot table.
Good. So let's look at that now. So I'm going to take off the frequency distribution. I'm going to ungroup. And I think I'm going to keep this pivot table here. So to create your charts, you can right click on it. And let's see. Pivot table options. No, it doesn't give you under here. So you basically click on any cell once again to highlight the table, and you go to Pivot Table Analyze, and notice Pivot Chart is here. You can choose Pivot Chart, and this box is going to come up, and you basically select what type of chart do I want. So say for instance I want a column. Okay. And I have a chart here now alongside my pivot table. So whenever I change my whenever I change my pivot table, it automatically updates my chart. So that's another thing to remember. When you create a chart and you change the original data, the chart is automatically updated. Charts automatically update. So notice I'm changing the data. It's automatically changing. So charts automatically update. But as I was showing you, pivot tables do not automatically update. So I can delete Korean once again and put in Japanese. And notice I don't have Japanese here, so I would need to refresh in order to get that updated language there. And notice the chart automatically updated itself. So that's two things you need to remember there. Pivot tables do not automatically update, whereas charts automatically update. And that is also how you create your pivot chart. So a pivot chart is linked to a pivot table. As you change the pivot table, it will automatically change the pivot chart also. Are you guys following?
Yes, sir.
All right. So modifying pivot tables. Sierra, could you continue?
Modifying pivot tables. As you add or delete columns or rows in the original setting data, these changes are not automatically updated by the pivot table. To update the pivot table, right-click anywhere in the pivot table and select Refresh. Sometimes you may not want to view all the results in your pivot table. Filtering data can be done by clicking on the arrow next to the row or column labels. This shows the list of options to select those you will include or leave out. In figure 7.54, we want to view only grades 1 to 3.
Great. So as mentioned already, your pivot table does not automatically update. You would need to refresh it in order to update it. And as the last part mentioned, there's also, you can say, a simple filter. So say for instance, we created this pivot table, but we don't want to see Japanese. We can click on the arrow and we can take out Japanese. So we don't want to see that language there. And notice even the chart automatically updated. We don't want to see, say for example, English, take it out, and even the chart updated also. So we have a filter option there with our pivot table. So last two paragraphs. Akila, can you read for us?
Pivot tables summarize your data by either summing or counting the items. You can, however, change the type of calculation, such as average, maximum, or minimum. Right-click on the cell with the aggregate function, then select Value Field Settings and select the new aggregate function and click OK. To delete a pivot table, select the entire range of data that makes up the pivot table, then press Delete. It will not alter the original data or other pivot tables or charts. You may want to delete the sheet with the pivot table if that is easier.
Good. So I already showed you guys that in your pivot table, remember the pivot table is used to summarize your data. That's important to remember, to summarize your data. And I showed you in the values here, it is actually summarizing age. So it's adding the age. And if you click on value field settings here, we can change the summarize option here. We can change it to count if you want, or any one of these options here, average, max, min, and so on. So if I want to count the age, I can do that. If I want to add it, get the maximum, I can do that. So that's how you change the summarize option. Now, how do you delete that pivot table? Well, it mentioned you simply highlight it and you press the delete key. And notice the chart remained at what you left it at the data you left it at. So the chart remained. Great. So that's how you would remove that pivot table there. All right. Any questions in any part before we wrap up? No questions? All right. So these are going to be your questions to next week. Please ensure you do them. We're going to review them next week. Practice your exercises. You can work on them in this, groups that if you're still keeping the same partner or you're forming new partners, let me know. Update it in the spreadsheet. But try to work the exercises individually. So you have this one to do, exercise 8 and exercise 9 and 10. So what did we look at today? What are the main points to remember? Remember, we're looking at searching for records. What are the different methods of locating data? Well, we can sort for data. We can sort one column. Remember, you just got to click on that one cell and use the sort option. But if you want to sort by more than one field, you need to use custom sort. The next method of searching for data is filters. We have two filters. We have the auto filter and simple filter. They both have their advantages and disadvantages. Auto filter, simple filter, it filters the data in place. You have to remember what in place means. It basically means where the data is already located. And the second type of filter is the advanced filter, which gives you more options basically. And what do you need to create your advanced filter? You need the original data, you need the criteria range, and you need the output area. Those three things. What are the two types of criteria? You have the AND criteria and you have the OR criteria. How do you tell their difference? Well, one of them is in the same row, that is the AND, and the other one is in two different rows. And it's important for you to remember how do they answer the questions. As you can see here, the AND criteria, it answers all the criteria at the same time. All of this must be true at the same time. Whereas OR, it's one after each other. It's going to look for all of this one and then all of that one there. Then we looked at the other method of, so this is basically our third method of searching for record, or pivot table. Remember, the pivot table is used to summarize data. It's like creating another table of your main data and summarizes it. These are the rules you must follow. Remember, no blank rows or columns. And remember, there are two kinds of pivot table. There's a one-dimensional and there is the two-dimensional pivot table. It's simply whether data is in the row or the column. Once it's in both, it's two-dimensional. If it's only in one, like for example this one here, it is one-dimensional. And we looked at what is the frequency distribution when you group data and you try to analyze that data to see some sort of trend, some sort of activity going on. Then another way of summarizing your data is basically from the pivot table, you create your pivot charts. Actually, the frequency distribution is another method also, but it basically comes from the pivot table. Then you have your pivot charts. Remember, charts automatically update, whereas pivot tables do not automatically update. And yes, that's basically it. So these questions are your homework for next week. Ensure you're practicing all of your exercises, not just what we need to do for next week. Keep practicing all of them so that you can remember how to use spreadsheets. Any questions before we close off?
No, sir.
No, sir.
All right, you guys fully understand everything? Or you just want to go and sleep?
Sir, both?
All right, so I shall see you guys next week. Enjoy the rest of your night.